Hello, and welcome to the Gallimaufry, a podcast about history. Thank you for joining us again. My name is Will, and I am joined by my lovely assistant, Nick.
Hello there.
It's the main thing you bring, really, isn't it, your loveliness?
Yes, I am a beacon of sunshine.
You are the Debbie McGee to my Paul Daniels.
Any other musical acts or cabarets
you
want
could
to...
be the PJ to my Duncan.
I don't know who that is.
They were Ant and Dec during their musical career, wasn't it?
Oh, what? You are the Dick to my Dom.
Moving on. Yes, thank you for joining us again for another fun-filled delve into history.
Today's exciting episode is going to be focusing on the pyramids. We don't mean like schemes, like, you know, your gran tries to get you involved in selling washing up liquid for £5. We're talking about the actual original pyramids in Egypt.
Yes, the pyramid-shaped ones.
Exactly that. So, yes, we're going to travel to Egypt, famously the land of the pharaohs, and a setting for many a glorious Agatha Christie novel. Yes, those pointy monoliths that have adorned postcards for centuries and given travel agents many a happy evening.
What kind of a happy evening?
Well, they just sell a lot of package holidays.
Oh, okay. All right. Maybe they stay at home and have a nice quiet think about the pyramids.
I mean, don't we all? They are majestical, magical, incredible things.
Yeah, they're lovely.
Which we're going to find out.
Very good.
Yeah.
Cool. Right, should we get on with it then?
Yeah, please. For the love of Ra, please.
For the love of Ra. Yes, very topical. Tutankhamun and get on with it.
That's just pretty good. That's pretty good. I'll take that, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a fair old joke you've got there. Fair old joke. No, that doesn't work.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm out. We're like 5 minutes in and I'm out of Egypt puns already.
Yeah.
I Sphinx. This is going to be a long episode.
You're just in denial.
So, but before we can come to those fancy buildings, though, it's worth mentioning a little bit about Egypt, as quite frankly, this history spans thousands of years. The often trotted out fact is that Cleopatra was born closer to the moon landing, the computer age, even the iPhone, than she was to the construction of the pyramids of Giza. And that wasn't even the first pyramid.
For thousands of years, Egypt was actually just a swampy dump. And we're talking like thousands and thousands of years ago, like when our Neolithic ancestors roamed North Africa, which was lush and fertile, but thanks to the changing climate, something we know all about, forced them south after the verdant lands of North Africa turned to desert. But this also changed the Nile Valley itself, which was soon an abundance of flowing water. And as with all places with fresh water, people flock to it because, you know, everyone needs something to drink and pee in when they get too drunk. And soon communities were established, eventually forming two distinct ones. Now, what's curious about Egypt is they have a lower region and an upper region. However, they're kind of the other way round. We talk about the lower region, which is actually north, bordering the Med, and the upper region, which is more southern and stretches towards Sudan. So they've kind of got it topsy-turvy, upside down.
So low is up and up is low.
Yes. And we know all about setting the bar low here. And slowly, over the years, the upper region extended its dominance over the lower. It basically just meant that their culture came to dominate the whole of Egypt. And we don't actually know a lot about this period of history we're going to be talking about. That's something we clarify up front. Everything we know is from like tablets and drawings that are very vague and loose. And so archaeologists have done their best to piece together the impressions we have. So a lot of what we talk about isn't absolute. As with all things, nothing is ever absolute. That's a general scientific approach to everything everyone should take in life. Despite wild myths suggesting Egypt united after a glorious and bloody battle led by a warrior named Menes, who conquered every town, basically, if you would believe the legends, it looks largely to have happened quite peacefully and organically as sort of different cities came together and merged, thanks to the dominating culture of Naquada in the upper region, and I've probably said that wrong.
Our ancient Egyptian speakers are going to be very upset with you.
Yes, they are. However, many scholars think that Menes might have actually been a king named Narmer, who is widely considered the first ruler of Egypt and founded the first dynasty. And they get all this information off something called the Narmer palette, which is essentially a big stone carving that depicts a king achieving victory over his foes. It also suggests Egypt had been unified because on the carving you had this giant creature with like two serpent heads intertwined, which is said to represent the lower region and the upper region, and they're coming together. So it's a sense of this king has vanquished all his foes and united Egypt.
However, we accept these events as there is no other way of knowing if they are entirely accurate. Still, if Narmer was the first true king, he would have ruled over 1 to 2 million people and built the city for the ruling bureaucracy later known as Memphis. He cements the mythology of the pharaoh being a demigod, and thus making the basis of a society without a king unthinkable. And with his ever-expanding bureaucracy comes a civil service and the inevitable taxation of living in a kingdom. If you ever get the chance to see the Palette in Cairo, it's worth the visit. It's only 63 centimetres tall, though it's one of the most important artefacts in ancient Egyptian history, even if it's probably a bit of propaganda. Regardless of how it came to be, Narmer kicked it off, and what followed were 30 dynasties that ruled for nearly 3,000 years until some Macedonian bloke made a bit of a mess.
So yes, just to put this in context, one historian has placed these dynasties in a lot of different periods, but we'll be mainly using the terminology of Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and then Late Kingdom. But in actuality, there's probably about 10 different periods you can cut this into.
I mean, you have to remember that we're looking for thousands of years of history, and that's too much history.
Well, you can never have don't tell the people that you can never have too much history. Never.
No, not enough history. Thousands more.
Exactly, yes.
Yes.
Anyway, that brings us neatly on to the pharaohs.
Yes, so like many historic monarchs, pharaohs act as both heads of state and religious leaders, often regarded as a divine intermediary between the people and the gods. Some pharaohs even got a little ahead of themselves and claimed to be the literal embodiment of one god or another, leading to more than a few cults of personality. The word pharaoh derives from the Egyptian term for great house, a reference to the lavish palaces where the pharaohs resided. While the phrase did originally refer to the palace, by the New Kingdom it had eventually come to cover both the position of the monarch and the individual currently holding it. The earliest known reference of the monarch being referred to as pharaoh was in a letter to Akhenaten, dated sometime in the mid-14th century BCE. By the 10th century BCE, the phrase had shifted entirely to refer to the ruler of Egypt without any of that big house nonsense. As leader of the Egyptian people, the pharaohs were responsible for all the usual ancient ruler jobs, so making law, waging wars, collecting taxes, and being as big a dick as they pleased because they were the pharaoh, and who the hell were you? All that, combined with being a walking deity, made for quite the busy life, so it was only fair that they could look forward to a nice afterlife at the end of it all. And this is where the pyramids come in.
Yeah, just going back to, we were talking about the lowers and upper regions, right?
Yeah.
So the upper region would eventually come to dominate culturally.
The lower and upper regions.
Yeah.
I didn't know we were this kind of podcast.
So there was an area called Nakada, and it's from this area that the culture of Egypt developed. You know, the idea of funeral rites and burying mummies and building massive tombs all comes from them as part of the upper region of Egypt that slowly became to dominate the rest of it. In a way, the pyramid is the ultimate status symbol for when you're dying. Like, hey, look how important I am. Look at this big, massive place that's going to be me. That's going to have me buried in. It's a bit like how billionaires now have rockets they send into space. It's like, haha, look how big my penis is.
It's a big dick waving contest.
It is. And this was in part fueled by the belief that your spirit was essentially immortal. But in order to exist once the physical body died, it needed to be preserved as best as possible. So you get the idea of mummies. And in order to preserve the mummies, they stick them in tombs. And there was the idea that actually, if you died, and this didn't just apply to pharaohs, this applied to everyone. The pharaoh was blessed with something called a tripartite soul, so formed of three things: a bar, which is like a bird-like representation of their personality, that allowed it to soar above the skies. Mm-hmm. The ka, a spirit compelled to stay close to the body, that needs the nourishment of all those things placed in the tomb around it. And the aka, representing the immortality of those spirits. So, kind of makes sense. Bodies were initially wrapped, before they came to the idea of mummification, bodies were initially wrapped in animal skin. And for years, actually, they used to bury bodies just in the sand because it would just not decompose in the sand. And they buried stone cairns on top of them. But then they started placing them in coffins. Then they started building little tombs of mud brick, because mud brick was a really useful and easy to build material, thanks to the Nile. And the earliest mummies are actually found from the very first dynasty, so that they preserved these things. They knew how to do them. But it was a gradual process of refinement. I guess the bigger problem was when the sand and the stone cairns that they initially did were disturbed, once the sand was removed, the bodies would, begin to rot. And I guess that would upset the spirits of the pharaohs gravely.
Oh, you kill me.
Oh, do you want to be buried as a mummy?
I'd like to give you a... No, let's not finish that sentence. Carry on.
So as mentioned, they spent centuries refining how to halt the decomposition process, and that eventually led to mummification, where you get all the traditional images we have of Egyptian burial, where they pull the organs out through the nose, and they do all those sort of things where they put them in jars, because they were just... If you leave all the organs in the body, they aid the decomposition much quicker than if you've just got a hollow body.
So the organs weren't important for the
well, they were,
spirit.
because they kept them in jars in the tombs.
Oh, okay.
But essentially, they just needed a vessel. They just needed to preserve the physical shell. And as long as they keep that in the best working condition as possible, albeit heavily dried out and wrapped in bandages,
Right.
the spirit of the pharaoh or whoever was buried could remain, around and enjoy life, or afterlife in this case. And all of this work was essential to the rebirth idea that was really entrenched in Egyptian society. And of course, as society progressed, the tombs got bigger and bigger and bigger. After it was a status symbol, and if you have to live for all eternity, you want to live in comfort. And funny enough, when they first buried pharaohs in tombs, initially people were also buried with them. So they're all their favourite mates and who they especially loved in life would actually just be slaughtered and put in the tomb with them.
Oh, they'd have some company then.
Yes.
You wouldn't want to fall out with them, would you, if you were stuck in the tomb with them for eternity?
But actually, back then it was a great honour, because the pharaoh was basically a god, and if the god says, "I want you to come into the afterlife with me," you'd be like, "Yes, mate, all right."
It's a bit like you being trapped down in this basement with me.
Thankfully, this ritual sacrifice didn't actually last long, so it only lasted in the span of one dynasty. However, it did see the death of a lot of people. For instance, one pharaoh, King Jet, took 318 people with him when he went.
And were they entombed alive, or were they sacrificed?
No, they
beforehand?
were sacrificed before.
Okay, well
they weren't just buried alive.
Yeah, somehow that seems more reasonable.
Otherwise, they just eat all the food that's already been put down.
Oh, they put food down there.
Yeah, they put everything. They thought they would need everything that they needed in real life in the afterlife.
Oh, so they packed them a lunch.
They did. Unfortunately, they also realised that things decompose as well.
Yeah.
So eventually they started creating symbols of food and putting them in the tombs to represent food in the afterlife, and that's how they kind of got around it.
I'd be very upset if someone packed me a lunch and I opened it and it was just symbols of food.
You could imagine eating the bread.
I could.
Yeah.
I could imagine doing other things as well, like things I could do to the person who packed me a box full of symbols of food and said it was lunch.
And essentially, these stone cairns that we were talking about earlier evolved into these big sort of bench-like structures called mastabas. Mastabas, it's actually an Arabic word for bench.
Okay.
Hence, they were quite rectangular structures, so they looked like massive benches. And these were the initial tombs that pharaohs are buried in. This is before the pyramid fashion kicked off and that became trendy. These weren't specifically for pharaohs. If you were a wealthy bureaucrat, you could have nice digs in the afterlife as well. You could be buried in mastabas like this for slightly less well-off people than the pharaoh. And they were actually quite colourful buildings. And people were buried slightly underground in burial chambers around them. You weren't just buried in the structure, you were always buried underground.
Right.
And that's because from centuries of them burying people in the sand, they've realised if you bury them underground, you're going to preserve them for longer.
Oh, okay.
A lot of these buildings don't survive anymore because they were massive and built out of mud brick. And while mud brick is a fantastic material, it kind of crumbles after a few centuries.
So, speaking of mud bricks, Egypt's greatest assets came from its landscape and would provide the literal building blocks for many of its structures. Thick mud lined the Nile, which, unlike other rivers, flooded in the summer rather than the winter, due to monsoon rains in the Ethiopian highlands flooding the rivers and lakes in June to September. This mud was a mixture of clay and sand, which was perfect for building in the heat of the country. Better still, they are cool in the summer and warm in the winter. Perhaps a few tips for us, eh?
I could live in a mud brick hut.
Could you?
Yeah, as long as there was like a wall socket for the PlayStation, that'd be fine.
Yeah, as long as the rent was reasonable. Anyway, so how do you make a mud brick? So you take the mud collected from the fields, break it up and trample it down. usually with your feet. Then add a binding element like straw or dung to make it a bit more pliable and plastic. It then gets
I was going to say that's sounding less appealing now.
a little bit, yeah. I mean, you'd have a job finding a tradesman in London who is willing to trample dung with his feet. It then gets placed in a box-like mould and left to dry. Once dry, you can plaster or paint it, or you can even tile it. Because of this material, it allowed the Egyptians to experiment with building huge structures rather easily and in no time at all. But after a few hundred years, these buildings dissolved. So the Egyptians turned to stone. The eastern desert was home to stones of many shapes and colours. I think your dad would love this. He does love it.
Just to clarify, my dad is a geologist. He's not a sand obsessive.
He loves a good rock.
He does.
He loves a good rock. He loves
Our house growing up was called La Rochelle.
The history of your dad will be another episode, I expect. Speaking of the Egyptians, they had an abundance of limestone, known as white santi, hard red granite, red quartzite, and schist, or greywacke. They also had lots of gypsum and basalt, which were used to plaster and mortar. And thankfully, it was all close to the Nile, which provided a ready-made transport system for the blocks. Ancient Egypt was not a nation of roads. They favoured boats and barges, building canals where needed. But Egypt was also huge. It would take 2 weeks to deliver a message north to south, so those in charge did not confine themselves to only one city. Instead, they effectively went on a monarchy roadshow, or in the case, river show, sailing up and down the Nile, meeting and greeting to remind people they had a ruler and he wanted to be respected.
So we have a long history of honouring the dead. We have exceptional building materials, a massive belief that the soul is eternal, and a huge desire to make sure that the afterlife was comfortable as possible. So you can see why this is all coming together. The trouble with most of these structures so far, though, is that they crumbled after a few hundred years, and they were incredibly easy to rob. In fact, Egyptians would rob them with such frequency themselves over the centuries to come.
So this belief that the pharaoh was an important demigod who needed to be revered, this didn't trickle down to the commoners then?
Well, it did and it didn't, because Egypt was invaded so many times.
Oh, okay.
They fought so many wars, but also just pharaohs would rob other pharaohs. Like, we'll come onto this a bit later. But when a pyramid was built, it wasn't just a pyramid. You were building like a whole city in a way. You had temples, you'd have markets, you'd have as you mentioned, a cult around this pharaoh, and each pharaoh was obviously in homage to a deity, and this would change over the centuries from one god to another god. But essentially, each pharaoh considered themselves really special. So when the other pharaoh died and they became the ruler, they could basically say, well, I'm the god now. That person doesn't need all that stuff.
Oh, so the current pharaoh is always the top pharaoh.
Yeah.
Right.
So what are the pyramids? After about half an hour preamble.
What are the pyramids?
The pyramids don't need any introduction. Unless you spent your life under a rock, or rather a fancy polyhedron-shaped one, you've almost certainly heard of the Egyptian pyramids. They are the last surviving example of one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. All the others crumbled, destroyed, dismantled, what you have, but the pyramids are still standing, and they're a testament to the ingenuity of this ancient people that inhabited the Nile Valley all those centuries ago. So the earliest known pyramids are found in Saqqara. It's just across the way from Memphis and almost basically opposite Cairo. And it's believed to have been built during the reign of a ruler known as Zoser or Yoza. He's actually spelt with a D at the front, but it's silent D.
And sometimes it's a silent J as well.
Is it?
If it's Zoser.
Well, there's no Z in it.
There's a silent J and an invisible Z.
Anyway, he's apparently ruled in the 27th century BCE. He is generally accepted as the person who kick-started the pyramid trend, with the very first pyramid, often referred to as the step pyramid, because it's not how we think of a pyramid as being sort of flat sides. It was literally steps. And so, amazingly, despite the fact it was built thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago, it's still around. You can still go and see it.
Oh.
Yeah. It was nearly threatened with extinction very close to the beginning of the millennium. And then they embarked on a huge restoration project, which was also interrupted by COVID.
Oh.
But thankfully, now you can go and see it today, fully restored to its original glory.
That's good.
It is very good, yeah. So when it was originally built, it was built from large cut stones and clad in polished white Tura limestone. Now, Tura limestone will become a theme of all pyramids, from this pyramid right to one of the last ones. And essentially it's this very bright white reflective limestone that basically makes the building shine. So when we think of the pyramids today, we think of these sort of yellowy red brick buildings, but that's it naked. That's it without its clothes on. All of these pyramids used to be beautifully white and reflective and shining. There you go, 6,000 years of history. Ooh. Summed up in one gleeful noise.
You said the word shiny, you got my attention.
Before Zoser, it was common for pharaohs to be buried in these mastabas we've been talking about. But obviously he decided that it just wasn't good enough for him. Now, we don't actually know how he came to decide that building a step pyramid was better than, just a bench. But he did. Now, he was the pharaoh from the 3rd dynasty, so the Old Kingdom. And it was the first dynasty of the Old Kingdom, actually. And he ruled from the modern-day city of Memphis. It's believed that he ruled between 19 and 28 years because, again, records are patchy, so we don't know the exact dates of everything, during which he came up with the idea of a step pyramid, or he came up with the idea of the step pyramid in conjunction with his vizier, Imhotep. But one of the other intriguing things about his step pyramid was that it was not built out of mud brick. It was built out of stone. And that was a major innovation because it meant it would last a lot longer. And the sheer size of the building project suggests that during the time of the 1st dynasty to the 3rd dynasty, there have been huge advancements in state control, as the scale of resources and workers required to build this would have been absolutely staggering. We're talking tens of thousands of people here, shifting massive millions of tons of stone around Egypt in a society which doesn't have the wheel. They've just got boats. But interestingly, it also actually started life as a mastaba, but not a rectangle one, a square one. So maybe when Imhotep saw the square and thought, or maybe even Zoser thought, this doesn't look grand enough. Can we put another one on top? Maybe another one.
Yeah.
But
if in doubt, add more mastabas.
Exactly. A tomb was supposed to be a grand statement at the end of the day, so perhaps that was the feeling behind it. The idea of using stone, though, actually came from his dad, who used stone in his burial chamber underneath his mud brick mastaba. So that was one area that he'd sort of taken from his family. And that's actually a family trait that we're going to see over the next couple of hundred years, that the son always wants to improve on the father. We don't know who's entirely responsible for the design, as we've said, but I think most historians agree it may have been Imhotep, who seemed to have a very design and engineering mind that was just one of his many, many, many traits, because aside from being an eccentric architect, he was the priest of the sun god Ra at Heliopolis.
But if you've ever watched that film The Mummy from the 90s, you're probably already familiar with Imhotep, who was known for his love of eating human flesh and sowing evil throughout the world. What that film didn't mention, though, was that he was also a chancellor, high priest, and pioneering architect who would later be widely deified for his accomplishments. It's just a shame that he got into all that flesh-eating business when he was obviously very talented.
Just so you know, The Mummy is not historically accurate. Just for anyone who's actually thinking it is. It's not. It's not.
Don't know. Opinions differ.
It's not. Although weirdly, we may have no way of knowing. So but I'm fairly sure it's not.
It's in the air.
It's not.
Could go 50-50.
It's not.
6 or 1. Anyway, but not much is known of Imhotep's life. No text mention his name for the first 1,200 years after his death. However, there are several short inscriptions from his lifetime which establish who he was and that he was a pretty important guy in ancient Egyptian society. But moving on, the original mastaba, before it was built upon, stood at 8 metres high and 63 metres on each side, and it was made of Tura limestone and built to line up with the 4 points of a compass. Not that the ancient Egyptians had compasses. To achieve this, and to reduce the amount of work involved, Imhotep ordered that the stones be laid at an angle of 20 degrees inwards rather than laying them flat, and of course to use bigger stones. This made its structure lighter and safer, and of course gave it a distinctive slope. By the time they had finished it, it stood 62.5 metres high, with a stack of 6 mastabas containing 330,400 cubic metres of limestone. I mean, your dad must have pricked up his ears at that. That's a lot of limestone. Anyway, compared to the familiar sight of the Giza pyramids, it looks like a poor cousin, with jagged sides and a distinctly flat top. In many ways, it was the prototype pyramid. Djoser was so pleased, Imhotep's name was carved onto his statue, a tremendous honour for any mere mortal.
Thankfully, he wasn't buried with him.
No, that's been a nice thing for Imhotep. The interior mirrored many of the previous customs, however, with chambers for Djoser, his family, and rooms for goods decorated in porcelain tiles. Djoser's own chamber was granite and dug 28 metres down, before being sealed with a massive granite block. A series of confusing passages were installed to prevent robbers, but as with all things, time gets the better of them, and robbers did eventually pillage the tomb.
And actually, it was also nearly wiped out by an earthquake in the 90s, after centuries of wear and tear. But thankfully, it's still standing. And many historians argue that it's actually a testament to how well Djoser's kingship must have been run that he achieved it, as it required huge organisational exploitation of not just manpower, but mineral exploration. In fact, one historian actually named Joyce argues that if not for this building, Egypt would not have blossomed into the formidable bureaucratic state it would become, because all of these tombs required huge amounts of organisation and huge state bureaucracy. Because you need literate workers, strategists, organisers. And also interesting, Egyptians are also great conservationists, because there weren't many trees in Egypt. You had to recycle a lot of old parts, especially wood for boats, which was in short supply. But we'll come to the mystery of construction a little later. Because sadly, Djoser, who kicked off this tradition, we don't know where his body's gone. It's never been found. Like, he's missing.
Why would you steal a body?
It's quite easy to steal a body from these pyramids, as we'll find out. The remains have been recovered in the 19th century. They were lost at sea. Brilliant.
Mm-hmm.
And other parts found can't really be verified if they're him or members of his family or lovers or whatever, mistresses. However, anticipating such an event, as if by some sort of prescience that he had, Djoser commissioned a life-size painted version of himself, and you can find this in the Cairo Museum if you want to have a look. So Djoser started a trend which was then followed on by Sekhemkhet, who ruled over a decade after him and commissioned a number of step pyramids over his reign that would actually, funny enough, be completed by the people that came after him, because his reign lasted only a few short years. In fact, one of his biggest achievements was completed by 4th Dynasty King Snefru, and stood at 8 tiers high, roughly 92 metres, and this is known as the Maidum Pyramid, which almost looks like medium, spelt wrong, but hate to see a large one. Yeah, I'll just go. I'll get my coat.
But I liked it, I think. Yeah. But Snefru, which means to make beautiful, certainly lived up to his name. Aside from following in the family business of building giant stone tombs, he also constructed a wooden palace made of cedar that sadly has not survived. His reign is suggested to be between 24 to even 50 years, thanks to some handy graffiti on the inside of a tomb. He built pyramids in Dahshur and Selia, weighing in a combined 3.5 million cubic metres of stone, heavier than the Great Pyramid to come. The Maiden Pyramid was slightly different in design, with a chamber built in the centre of the pyramid rather than underground. And because it took so long, the new king Snefru changed some things around for it, filling in the steps with smooth limestone to create a slope. However, they would not stand the test of time, and the limestone slid off in years to come thanks to a combination of being built on sand, rough winds, and thieves. It was never filled with a body, so he clearly wasn't too moved by this. Although never truly finished, it formed the basis of the archetypal true smooth pyramid with its design of Tura limestone panels that gave it a distinct smooth slope. His next major accomplishment would be the Dahshur pyramid, built closer to Djoser's original monument. It was also close to where he built a new mud brick palace, which may explain his desire to stay put forever. It would end up towering over his last creation, standing at 105 metres high, with a whopping 1.2 million cubic metres of stone. However, the angle of the side sloped at 60 degrees, creating cracks at the top, leading the engineers to extend the base and add new stones, though most significantly the stones changed layout around 9 layers up. By the time it was finished, it sat at 43 degrees and gave it a squarish appearance at the base with a pointy top. It's often called the bent pyramid because of how it slopes.
Yes, and we encourage you to Google what the bent pyramid looks like, because it does look like someone's building it and halfway through they have a bit too much to drink, and then suddenly it just goes a little wonky.
It may have been built by a bunch of cowboys and somebody else had to come and try and recover it.
But in addition to this, temples were also placed around it. As we've mentioned, these pyramids were the hub for a whole community and city filled with priests and crafters and people. But more importantly, he also added a sort of new design flourish, if you will, to building a pyramid. Because he built a tiny version of it just behind it. So it's like called a mini pyramid, built from the foundations up in the same horizontal courses as the main one. And this was called the Queen's Pyramid, so naturally smaller than the King's.
Oh.
See, always getting unfairly treated throughout history, women. You know, why is a queen-sized bed smaller than a king? It's just not fair.
It's not, no.
But anyway, this Queen's Pyramid, however, has been argued by some historians to be the actual blueprint for all the other true smooth pyramids to follow, because this one wasn't bent. It didn't replicate the bent pyramid. It was actually smooth all the way up and down.
Oh, okay. At least you got it right this time.
Yeah, they did get
Even
it
if
right.
it was
So, as always, send a woman to do a man's job and they'll get it right. The key difference was how it was built by placing the stones in horizontal layers upwards.
Right.
So that's how it achieved the true smooth pattern. Of course, Snefru arrived back fresh from a war in Nubia and Libya, victorious. So he was in quite a good mood, but he arrived to find his slightly wonky pyramid and wasn't too happy, so immediately commissioned a third. Well, you know, third time's a charm, I guess, hopefully.
Well, he couldn't have his wife having a nicer pyramid than him.
Exactly, yeah. And this would end up being called the Red Pyramid and ultimately be his resting place. This was built with a base of solid limestone 220 metres long, and they laid red limestone core stones cased with Tura limestone cut into a 43-degree angle. This pyramid had 3 chambers with a system of core bells to help maintain the weight of the structure, and it would stand 105 metres tall. Interestingly, though, his burial chamber was angled east to west to be aligned with the entirety of the pyramid complex. So orientation was quite important in Egyptian society because you had to face the direction of the gods. The bent pyramid, though, would end up becoming a satellite to its mammoth brother.
So they kept the bent pyramid around then?
Yes, they did.
Did anyone get buried in it in the end? Did he give it to, like, his mate or something?
No, it's empty.
It's empty.
Yeah.
Right. What a waste of time that was then.
I just, because I mentioned something there that people might not have an understanding of, and I didn't have an understanding of because I'm not an engineer. A core bell is basically a structural piece of stone, wood or metal that sort of protrudes from a wall and it carries weight. So think of an arch. And the core bell arch uses overlapping stones to create the arch shape, rather than shaping the stone into a sort of smooth semicircle shape, but just making the semicircle shape with horizontal layers. You make it incredibly more load-bearing, which is how it allowed them to build all these impressive structures inside.
Ah, that's pretty smart. Fortunately, Snefru's son, grandson and great-grandson would have better luck, each being bestowed upon their deaths with nice, straight-sided, square-based pyramids, all of which can still be seen today in Giza. His son, Khufu, even went one further and built the immense Great Pyramid, the tallest man-made structure on Earth at the time, at over 128.5 metres tall, only surpassed 4,000 years later by the Eiffel Tower. This monster was built somewhere between 2589 to 2560 BCE and took around 27 years to complete. Built from 2.3 million blocks, weighing more than 6 million tons, the Great Pyramid was a building like no other in the ancient world. To put those numbers into a bit of perspective, that's enough stone to build a 3-metre high wall all around France. I'm sure Khufu was happy with his pyramid and all, but I'm a little disappointed that we could have had a Great Wall of France instead.
I know, there's still time.
Still time.
There's
We could
still time.
dismantle the Great Pyramid of Giza and build that wall.
Although, to be honest, a lot of Brexiteers here will probably want to do that these days.
Yes. I was getting a little bit Trumpy there.
Mm.
Build that wall. The tradition of building square-based, four-sided, smooth pyramids continued for many generations after Khufu. Something that's interesting to note is that they are all oriented perfectly, with north, south, east and west facing sides. It's likely that the Egyptians used the stars to ascertain which way was north, as we can see later pyramids drifting in orientation slightly in correlation with the stars moving across the sky over the years.
Now, funny enough, again, because we don't know too much about this period, by all accounts, the great pharaoh Khufu he was labelled a horrible, harsh tyrant, and this comes from historical accounts made by Greece historian Herodotus. Now, of course, he's writing thousands of years after the reign of Khufu, so, he might have well have been making it all up. In actuality, there exists only one carving as a testament to his reign, and it doesn't really tell us much about whether he was a right bastard or not. What we do know is that he actually reigned quite a fair old lick, and estimates of his reign range from 20 years to 63. And he was aided in his grand design of the Great Pyramid by his vizier and nephew Himenu, whose official title is Vizier, High Priest, Keeper of Sacred Animals, Elder of the Palace, Overseer of Scribes, Director of Music, and Overseer of Construction Projects.
He must have been very busy as well.
He definitely had his hands full.
Yeah.
Another classic case of family nepotism there. In his first year as pharaoh, though, Khufu chose virgin land of limestone in Giza to build his pyramid, and travelled out to perform the foundation ceremony, where lots of animals are sacrificed. Offerings are made to the goddess of builders who were asked for favour in construction. And obviously those offerings worked, because what we were left with is pretty damn amazing.
I'm wondering if next time I have the builders around, I should be making offerings to the goddess of builders.
Bring out a sheep. Just like, here you go. The base is 13 square acres. Acres. And the sides measure 230 metres at the base alone. And each side is a perfect right angle upwards at 51 degrees. Heavy stones around 1.5 metres high form the base, and they get smaller as you gradually get upwards. And it's built around 3 massive central chambers, as well as a myriad of passageways and walkways. And it, as you mentioned, it got really high, but when in its original day, it reached the sky, topping out at 146.5 metres. Today, it measures around 137 to 138 metres, and that's because it's lost its outer casing. As we mentioned, all of these pyramids were covered in Tura limestone, which gave it this great reflective glory. But obviously those have been stolen over the years. Roughly around 8,000 granite blocks line the passageways inside, and these would have been floated all the way down from Aswan, which is some like 860 kilometres away. So it really did touch the lives across all Egypt to build this thing. Anyway, like father, like son, his son, Jedefra, came next and immediately tried to outdo his dad. It's like they have some sort of massive family complex.
Is that why you keep digging up all these rocks?
Exactly, yeah. Got to outdo my dad.
You've got to have the biggest rock.
He chose a spot just north of his father, dug a trench and built his pyramid over it to allow easy access to his burial chamber. And that was actually a very innovative way of designing it. But crucially, he built his facing north, which is slightly different from his dad's. He was the first pharaoh to use the title of Son of Re, but otherwise his building was unremarkable, only reaching 67 metres.
A bit pathetic, really, isn't it?
It was very pathetic. He definitely did not live up to his dad.
Why bother?
Exactly. And what's worse is little of it remains today. Whilst the pyramid was smaller, the chapels and temples around it were more detailed and more lavish and more complex. But his reign was relatively short, so he never actually got to see the brilliance of these massive red granite temples.
So Jedefre was succeeded by his brother Khafre, who was determined to outdo their father, even if space in the area was lacking. Khafre's pyramid reached 143.5 metres, just short of his dad's, but he built it on a higher bit of bedrock, so it looked taller. It's clever, isn't it? It also angled 51 degrees, meaning less materials were needed, but it was built rather sloppily compared to the others, with wide gaps, stone layers out of alignment, and sparing use of mortar. The interior was quite stark and simple as well, with a plain burial chamber. But outside, where everyone can see, was jazzed up with splendid decorative temples with walls of polished ink granite, white alabaster floors, and tremendous depictions of Khafre himself, often dressed in a simple kilt and showing off his abs.
Can you imagine if Egyptian pharaohs had Instagram? How crazy would that be?
And of course the Sphinx, the lion body with a man's head that sits near the entrance to the mortuary complex. It stands at 73 metres long, 20 metres tall, and faces east to west, aligned with Khafre's pyramid. However, it wasn't built by him or his sons. It appears to be older than them and originally painted. Weirdly, however, it is omitted from historical reports around the area. Sphinx, however, were an explicit symbol of power, but it does appear to have been updated by New Kingdom pharaohs.
So that's something I found quite interesting, is that like they just sort of They were gradually updated each time someone built a pyramid and preserved, but no one actually knows where they came from.
Yeah, though also nobody really knows how it lost its nose either.
Yes, there's that apocryphal story about Napoleon's troops shooting its nose off.
Yeah, there's that one, and there's another one about an Islamic missionary who got so annoyed with the locals praying to it that he broke the nose off.
Yes, but according to historical records, it actually had the nose broken off centuries ago, like around this time, and then it was replaced and it just kept falling off. So it might just be because of the way it was carved, it just kept falling off, and then in the end they just decided to sod it.
Doesn't need it's a lion, you know.
But it also would have been painted as well, like beautifully ceramically painted. You know how like we talk about Greek and Roman statues, we think of those sort of white marble stones. They would have been painted.
Yeah.
And over the centuries they've lost that paint. So everything we know about the modern world would have been much more colourful. So after Khafre came his son, Menkaure, and he was probably the last pharaoh to build what we consider the last of the ancient pyramids. And his pyramid stood at only 65 metres.
I can see why he gave up after that.
Yeah, I mean, by this stage, everyone was looking at them going, they're easily robbed. My dad's already built a massive one. His granddad's built even a more massive one. Like, I can't compete. However, he was buried in a flashy basalt sarcophagus.
That was do his own thing.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, size isn't everything. It's about the quality of the workmanship.
Yeah, and, basalt.
In just a few generations, ancient wonders have been built that would last to today. Like, these pyramids are still around, most of them. And his pyramid, as well as Khafre's and Khufu's, is designed symmetrically. And you mentioned about using the stars as a sort of alignment. Scientists have found that they follow Orion's belt. So they match the layout of Orion's belt. They're built to align with them. So after Menkaure, his son, Shepseskaf, reverted to a traditional Sonte mastaba after taking over, which is basically returning to the giant benches of old. And then the person that succeeded him was Yusakaf. We're not really sure if he was the son or grandson of him because, as we said, records are patchy. But by now, the whole of Egyptian society was geared around pyramid building. But we were coming to the end of it. Whole communities and stratums of society had been established over the last 2 centuries. And it had the strange effect of giving power and wealth to these new communities, drawing it away from the crown. So because they spent all this money on building pyramids, they'd lost their sort of wealth. And the climate was changing and the middle class was growing. Societal lines were beginning to blur because of this pyramid building. So in a way, the act of building these pyramids had advanced society.
Inadvertently.
They
didn't want to advance society.
Exactly, yeah. They wanted them to be like, worship me, bitches, worship me. And because of this, it made the concept of the pharaoh more human than deity.
Oh, so it's all gone wrong then.
Yeah, because if you've got enough cash to start building your own pyramid, you're looking at the god king over there going, why haven't you got any cash, mate? You're a god. Yeah. However, Yusakaf did return to the pyramid structure, but massively downsized. It was only 49 metres high, his one in the end.
That's a bungalow, if anything.
It's a bungalow. However, he also embarked on the construction of another great architectural trend, a sun temple. And this was built far apart from his actual pyramid in the end, but we're not interested in the sun temple, but I advise you to go and Google it. It's a beautiful structure. His pyramid was established near Zosa's mortuary, while his sun temple was built on the site of the Heliopolis. And this tradition was carried on by quite a few pharaohs, and pyramid building did continue into the 6th dynasty, but increasingly became scarcer and scarcer, and by the 7th and 8th dynasties, only one pyramid was constructed by Kakura and built at Saqqara, and it was only 21 metres high and 31 metres square at the base. By now, the royal power was so fragmented in regional conflicts as city-states became kingdoms that the pharaoh had lost their power, their wealth, and the allure of building giant tombs to sustain them in the afterlife. However, this doesn't mean the death of pyramids, because it meant a lot of people decided they had enough money now to build their own. So you have the rise of the private pyramid. Yes. And to suppose when the kingdoms did fracture, the northern rulers still followed the pyramid tradition, but built on a very, very tiny scale, even smaller than the 31 metres we were just talking about. But what made them special was the intricate lavish interiors. So the focus had shifted on from being an external power source to having something nice on the inside. And the southern dynasties rejected pyramids entirely and started building things called saf tombs, which were essentially square tombs cut into bedrock with rows of pillars and doors. And eventually the Theban pharaoh, because when you get after the 10th dynasties, you get intermingling of Egyptians with different people from different communities, the Nubians, the Thebans, the Sudanese. This Theban pharaoh, Mentuhotep II, who would actually wrest control of all the kingdoms once more, did return to the ancient tradition of building monuments, but not pyramids. In fact, his great work was a tomb built in a natural bay at Del El Bahari, combining elements of a saf tomb and a pyramid, so he kind of created this fusion.
So the last pyramid would be built in the 18th dynasty by its first pharaoh, the Theban Ahmose, who reigned from 1550 to 1525 BCE. He was responsible for unifying Egypt again after a period of conflict with Nubia. Mines and quarries, after periods of uncertainty and unrest, were reopened, and trade blossomed again. Thebes effectively became capital with Ahmose's ascension. He was buried in a pyramid at Dra Abu el Naga, and this would be the final pyramid built by a royal family member. This didn't stop private individuals taking up the mantle, though. The village of Deir el Medina provides examples of pyramids constructed for wealthy officials, mainly made out of mud brick and usually hollow. Pyramid building may have died in Egypt, but it spread to nearby Nubia, who would eventually exert control over the region, and a host of Nubian pharaohs followed, but their pyramids were built in Nubia, now Nuri in North Sudan. Pyramids continued to be built, but never to the grandeur and skill of those of Giza. Most, if not all, have crumbled away, and 118 remain today.
And it's important to point out as well that by this stage, like feathery of tombs had become so common that there was no point building pyramids. Like even at the end of the last great ancient pyramids we've referred to, feathery was rampant. So they came up with lots of different ways to sort of prevent thefts, large granite slabs slid over entrances, secret passageways. But ultimately, despite putting loads of security doors in place with massive slabs of granite, robbers just worked out they could just tunnel through the surrounding limestone, which was quite soft, and just break in that way. But we've talked about these amazing buildings all through this podcast, but we haven't talked about how they were built. And this is an area of great debate. It's a subject of a lot of contention because we don't really know. But as we've sort of uncovered more artifacts, and particularly graffiti tells us a lot, because graffiti is often drawn by the average worker or the person at the bottom of the totem pole. And what we know of the pyramids now has actually been the work of countless exhibitions, starting as early as the 12th century by Caliph el-Mamun, who took the old school approach of using a literal battering ram to break into the Pyramid of Giza.
He must have been very keen to get inside.
Yeah. Unfortunately, he found the king's chamber bare, the walls stripped clean, and the sarcophagus empty. Further exhibitions would continue, culminating in the work of an archaeologist called William Petrie, who set off in 1880 to uncover the mysteries of Khufu's tomb in Giza. However, when he was excavating, it was actually a major tourist attraction even back then. So he was constantly interrupted by tourists. So he worked often late at night excavating, and during the day when he had to, often in bright pink underwear to scare away tourists.
I might try that.
Yeah. For his labours, he conducted the first proper survey of the pyramid to an amazing degree of accuracy that his results are still in use today. And though he didn't do this alone, he worked alongside Ali Gabri, a local workman who had worked on previous exhibitions. And together, over a number of years, they determined the size and scale of the pyramid.
So, despite using simple tools and thousands of workers, the Egyptians achieved almost impossible feats. Theories abound about how they were built. The massive Egyptian bureaucratic machine accounts for a lot of this, though. Towns have been found around the temples where workers lived their lives, with a mixture of professional designers and carpenters, religious folk and masons. The more low-skilled workers were shipped in from the region's farms on a seasonal basis. Work gangs comprised 2,000 men, split into smaller groups and living in barracks in these towns. Whatever their living conditions, the abundance of animal bones suggests they were well fed. Those who died were buried close to the pyramid in chambers, a great honour despite their status. This all suggests that they were not slaves, but workers of the state, harnessed into roles.
Just to add to that, how they got to all these measurements is, as you said, they didn't have compasses. So how did they do this? And it was all through maths, simply. But maths for the Egyptians also had a mystical edge to it, and it was their mastery of measurements and planning that allowed for the construction of these great buildings. And they used ropes to measure large objects and small wooden rods for smaller ones. So they had knowledge of right angles and certainly used sort of rudimentary set squares, whilst also being able to determine north using the stars, as we've said. And just to point out, these fibre cords they used could shrink or stretch, so there was a degree of inaccuracy in them. But despite this, the Great Pyramid is just 20 centimetres off on one side out of 230 metres. So that's an error of less than 0.1%. When it came to the actual construction, the leading theory of how they actually built using these massive heavy stones from the ground up suggests that they used a series of ramps. So there's one idea that there's this huge single straight ramp which allowed the movement of large stones up. And then they would build a series of like zigzagging ramps around it to move the other stones around, all with pulleys and levers and ropes to heave them up and down. So a complex, time-consuming and incredibly intensive workout for everyone involved. However, there is no actual archaeological evidence of such large ramps, but that doesn't disprove the fact that it might have happened or not, because otherwise, how would you do it? Tell me, Will, how would you do it?
How would you do it? Helicopters, cranes, giraffes.
Camels? You could have said camel, the one animal they have.
To achieve all this required great organisational ability. Egypt was one of the first nation states, and it had a very effective bureaucracy to ensure all these tombs were constructed with the Nile at the centre of them, all allowing the flow of materials. They kept quite detailed records, with one stone quarry site in Tura, even recording who slept in what room each night. And they did it all with basic tools, including bronze, stone and wood. Myths and theories abounded for centuries over the use of slave labour, with Herodotus estimating it would take 100,000 slaves to build. Modern analysis suggests it took a workforce of 40,000, with masons placing 340 blocks a day, but no one knows exactly how long it took to build or how many. A good rule of thumb is 20,000 working for 20 years.
I love that, a good rule of thumb.
You have to remember to suck air through your teeth when you say it as well.
Oh, yeah, 20 years, mate.
20 years. 20 years. I need 20,000.
But this is it. I mean, that 20,000 stat is dependent on the idea of time and how fast you're working. So that's 20,000 workers working for 20 years, almost like to clockwork. So there's no way of actually knowing how many people worked and how long it took. But we do know that, by and large, the pyramids were a combination of like permanent designers and crafters who lived nearby, coupled with seasonal workers who came in and out from the countryside to work. And we know this because our friend William Petrie again comes to our aid here, because he excavated a massive complex in 1888 near the Middle Kingdom pyramid of Fayum, which we haven't talked about because it's a minor pyramid. But here you find mud brick houses, rows of buildings that could feed the workers, house the workers, everything someone needed. And there are actually tombs built for bakers and supervisors. And it was a highly organised functional workforce that utilised temporary labour. Crews were divided into multiple workforces. So say at Giza you had a workforce of 15,000. This would be divided into left and right workforces. And within those workforces there'd be gangs of around 2,000, then subdivided further into 1,000 depending on job, role, task, skill. Graffiti even tells us these gangs had names. So one group was called the Drunkards of Menkaure.
They sound like a fun. You'd want to be part of their gang, wouldn't you?
Going further, these gangs were then drilled down even further, dependent on skill and job and ability, into 200, and then even further down into 20. So it's highly organised, it's very meticulous, everyone knows their role, their job, but they all feel part of a community, and they can all connect, and they all have a place to live. And as we've mentioned, this organisational ability flourished with each new pyramid built. And so by the end of the 4th dynasty, there was almost a symbiotic relationship between the creation of and flourishing of Egyptian culture and the building of pyramids, because you saw hieroglyphic and picture pictures that were normally used by Egyptians turn into cursive writing.
I mean, owl, feather, lion. Doesn't quite get the message across.
Yes, but also it's just time consuming doing that, whereas if you can just write it, you know your instructions from the off. And of course this needed literacy, it needed education, and hence the flowering of the middle class we talked about earlier. And you had massive barracks and agricultural complex to feed these workers, to house these workers, bakeries, fisheries. You had cattle and sheep being kept, which is why you get animal bones buried around these camps. And the temporary workers who were brought in to build the pyramids were paid in loaves of bread, measures of beer, hence probably why one of them was called the drunkards. And these building communities were basically their own mini economy and trading systems. And basically anyone who, as a transient worker, worked on the pyramids would then return home. They'd be richer for it in both food and education and seeing the world.
Yeah, so a bit of a win-win for the ordinary people, at least.
Yeah, because it essentially meant that you were spreading the wealth and you were spreading cultural growth to every stratum of society. It wasn't just for the rich and the elite.
I suppose they could walk past that pyramid and point at it and say, I helped build that.
Exactly, yeah. Which brings us neatly on to any particular myth or fact or funny name that you wanted to share. Funny anecdote, rather, that you wanted to share, Will.
Funny anecdote.
About Egypt.
Oh. Okay, so I have a little interesting tidbit for you, if you're interested.
I'm always interested in your tidbits.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that. So here it is. So the Egyptian word for pyramid was mer, which was depicted by an owl and a mouth in hieroglyphics. But the English word pyramid is actually Greek in origin. It's from the Greek word pyramis, which means a sort of pointy-topped cake. And this is because it was believed that the pyramids looked a bit like this certain kind of cake to the Greeks.
It's as with all invaders, they tend to name things, and those are the names that are accepted. So it's a bit of a mind-blowing fact to me that something that is so intrinsic to Egyptian society, we call by a Greek word.
I also find it fascinating that something sort of so grand and so important to the people who built them, that took decades to build and thousands of workers, and the Greeks come along and go, ha, that looks a bit like a cake.
Maybe they just got really hungry when they saw it.
Yeah. What have you come up with?
So my fact is about the Nile's length. So for many, many years, it was thought the Nile was the longest river in the world. And then in about 2007, a bunch of Brazilians came along and said, actually, the Amazon River is longer by a couple of 100 kilometers.
Well, they would say that, wouldn't they?
There's a kind of competition between the Amazon and the Nile to claim the longest river, that new expeditions keep finding where the sources are or claiming where the sources are, and they keep extending the lengths. Unfortunately, despite the fact we have massively advanced satellite imagery technology, we still don't know where the original sources of either are. So we have sort of guesstimations. And that's because rivers are constantly changing with water flow and seasons. It can be extremely difficult to get accurate readings of length and depth. So currently scientists think that some scientists think that the Amazon is slightly longer at 4,345 miles to the Nile's 4,258. But that's based on the results of, say, a Brazilian survey in 2007, which is not necessarily entirely reliable. Another interesting thing is the Amazon itself, despite being over 4,000 miles long, has no bridges across it.
No bridges?
No bridges. And anyway, flowing swiftly on.
Yes.
To the end of this show.
Yes. Cool. Yeah. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. But otherwise, unless you've got anything else to say. No? He's shaking his head. All that's left is to ask you to please keep listening. Please let us know your feedback. We love to hear from you all. And also make sure to subscribe. Or if you think we're out of order, let us know. Get some corrections.
Yeah, we love an angry letter.
Okay, just leave you with the clue for the next episode.